That's right. And we saw her.
She was traveling up to Seattle and at Seattle area, the appointment there. So we're just going to be zooming in.
Okay, okay. But she hasn't shown up yet on Zoom. Okay.
Chair, I just wanted to test the volume. We usually have trouble hearing people on Zoom. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear us?
Just like I was sitting there.
Okay. We can see you too.
Yeah, I just need a mute button nearby so when I start to hack.
Okay, so we're ready to start. Therefore, I will call the regular meeting of the Ashland Planning Commission to order for May 14th, 2024. The Planning Commission is conducting in-person regular meetings. However, the ability to participate electronically is continuing, as demonstrated by Doug. These meetings are via Zoom pursuant to state law. The public can find information on how to participate in Planning Commission meetings in our public notices. Directions on how to find the full meeting materials, applications, and staff reports on the city's website are also included in our public notices. So we have 5 members here in person and 1 member on Zoom for a total of 6. But we are expecting the 7th member, Susan Jan, so we'll see if she gets here. So we do have a quorum. Brandon, do you have any announcements?
From the Community Development Department, wanted to recognize staff who recently on May 11th participated in the Habitat for Humanity wall raising for their buildings in the Beach Creek subdivision. We were pretty fortunate that on a weekend, the Oregon Permit Technicians Association sponsored the event, and so Regan Trapp, who is, I think, their board chair, who's in our department, and Serena Locke from Jackson County invited our staff to attend, and Kendall Escuin, Regan Trapp, April Lewis, Michael Sullivan, Derek Severson, and Steve Mariaco all spent the day there helping build that unit. I also wanted to note on May 18th is the upcoming Historic Preservation Awards. I've mentioned it previously, but for those people watching at home, it's at Railroad Park at 10:30, and it will recognize the installation of the Hub Medallion and Historic Preservation Awards for developments that occurred over the last year within historic districts. And lastly, I would note that although it's outside the planning arena, the building code amendments are being put forth to the City Council on May 21st, and those relate to modifications in the state building code where certain provisions were removed and allowed for local adoption, namely some structural components as well as dangerous buildings. So we'll be newly adopting those into our code, whereas prior to 2021 they were covered under the state code. And additionally, Aaron Anderson and Veronica Allen, our 2 certified floodplain managers, had developed code provisions in the building code relating to development in the floodplain, which were recommended by FEMA, or forgetting the division, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, in order to have best practices for development in the floodplain. They're not often utilized because for the most part we don't allow development in the floodplain, but were to occur, streamlining our code to match with those best practices is what will be presented.
You're on top of things. Good for you. Okay. We're on to the consent agenda for approval of minutes for April 9th and April 23rd. Do I hear a motion to approve?
So moved.
Is there a second?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve the consent agenda. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, it was passed. I don't see anybody in the audience so we will not indulge ourselves in public forum tonight. Moving on to other business. The first one up is 2024 update to buildable lands inventory. Aaron, are you on deck for this?
Yeah, and as Aaron sets up his presentation, I wanted to give a brief introduction. Namely, this is a public hearing to adopt the buildable lands inventory, as it is a technical supporting document to our comprehensive plan. Just to go back in my history, when I started with the city of Ashland in 1999, my first major project was doing a buildable lands inventory. And that involved 6 months of intensive work going to every property in Ashland personally, and evaluating the site and determining its development capacity, and then bringing that back and working with more senior planners in terms of putting together that buildable lands inventory. Once completed, it was really the first assessment of every property in Ashland. And then we updated it again in 2004 with a minor update in 2005, a major update in 2011 because we had the advent of aerial photography that helped further refine it. In 2019, Aaron Anderson refined it further by applying our geographic information systems, doing spatial analysis work, looking at the floodplains and the steep slopes, and determining what areas of property that were previously identified as developable had severe constraints. I would note that you can still transfer the development capacity onto the remaining land, so it didn't necessarily change substantively the amount of land that's developed, but it showed us more accurately where it would occur. And so essentially the buildable lands inventory is really a tool that is a changing document. What you're seeing before you is a map and a report, but the side that you're not seeing is the back-end geographic information database that contains all of the information, including the assumptions on how much land is available, how much of that land is steep or floodplain. So all of that data is contained, and each time we do this buildable lands inventory, it's an opportunity to look at each lot a little closer, not just to remove those that have developed, but also apply changes that occur through zoning changes or other actions that the City Council and the Planning Commission might take. So Aaron's got a good presentation to go through that gets into both the purpose of the buildable lands inventory and some of the demographic assumptions behind it, and then some minutia, which hopefully you're interested in, getting into specific examples of how it applies comparing 2019 to now. And with that, thank you, Aaron.
So, excuse me, do I need to open the public hearing?
It is a public hearing, and so there should be an opportunity for people to provide comments and close the public hearing before you make a recommendation.
Okay,
Thank you.
therefore, I will open the public hearing. Now, it's your turn.
Thank you, Chair Werner, Planning Commission. Good to be before you again. We're going to need to get my presentation onto the screens. And can we confirm that Doug can see this?
I cannot see this. There we go. When I see Planning Commission regular meeting.
Terrific. All right, good to be before you this evening. So as Brandon said, thank you for the introduction. A buildable lands inventory is a requirement so the city can make sure that we have enough developable land for the 20-year planning period. The BLI was last updated in 2019. I did a lot of the GIS work in that, and it was interesting to revisit that project again. In terms of key findings, there's a lot of material in the report, but at the bottom line, there's over 288 net buildable acres across all zones, and 630 net buildable acres within the UGB. In terms of the rate of consumption, over the last 13 years, our residential land has been consumed at a rate of approximately 10.2 acres a year. In terms of dwellings, we went further than just taking the density and extrapolating the amount of dwellings expected. We really did almost a parcel by parcel evaluation of what could be expected. I'll go into that in a little more detail, but basically within the city limits, it's estimated that there's over 1,400 dwellings that could be accommodated, and then within the UGB, there's an additional 1,300. Over the last 6 fiscal years, the city has produced 90 dwelling units a year. In terms of the housing capacity analysis, which was completed in 2021, it determined that over the 20-year planning period, we needed 858 demand for new dwellings, which works out to an average of 43 a year. So those are sort of the real top line findings. I want to spend a few minutes talking about demography before we get into the BLI itself. Demographics, of course, is the driver of the population through birth, death, migration, etc. Since 1995, I believe, the state passed a law that required that the Portland Research, PSU, Portland State University, would do population predictions. And this took away the politicization of cities individually making their own projections. There's a great deal of detail in their modeling, but the bottom line is that the current forecast that goes out to 2072 is an increase from what was previously shown during the last iteration of the BLI. The demographic data was done in depth in both the housing capacity analysis and the housing production strategy. But since that time, newer data has become available, and so I did take this opportunity to update some of those figures, and I want to go through a few of them now. In terms of population age structure, the US is growing rapidly, growing older rapidly. In fact, between 2010 and 2020, the populations of 65 years and older saw the largest and fastest growth of any decade since the 1800s. Nationally, 16.8% of the total population is 60 or older. In Ashland, you can see that over time, that age tranche has gone from what was something on par with the national average to being nearly 28%. So you can see each bar there is a separate data set with the older, the 60-plus age set increasing in share of our population. This is a graph that compares to an exhibit within the housing capacity analysis, and again, shows the increasing of that sector of our population. In the housing capacity analysis, it reported that Ashland had 31% as opposed to 35% now. And to a lesser extent, that same increase happened in the county or in the state from 24 to 25. The state reported 29 in both. This is a look at the population pyramid. I also included error bars from the ACS. I think the census ACS data is very valuable, but it's important to realize that when you get down into smaller populations, those errors tend to become larger. This is the USA by comparison in 2000, 2010, and 2020. This is from a census data a census report on the US aging. And just for comparison, because I thought it was interesting, this also shows the 2010 population pyramid there in the blocks, and the shaded population pyramid is 2020 with the baby boom generation highlighted. So really what we're seeing locally is also happening on a national scale as well. This is from the Jackson County population pyramid, and so you see the same shape similarly in the county, but not quite as pronounced as in our shape. With regard to household size, there's a great deal of detail about trending in household size. This is table 12 from the report comparing the ACS data from 2013 and 17 to 18 and 22, showing decrease there in persons per household for rental occupied, but actually a small increase in the owner occupied units. And also this is the chart that compares to this is figure 10 from the report. Also worth noting, as it's called out in the text, that following what was done in the HCA, the census actually reports 3-person households and 4-person households. To make this chart comparable to it, those are rolled together. But Ashland only has, if you do break out and look at those 4-person households, Ashland only has 10% of households of this size. And it's interesting to compare that to the county and state, which are about 20% 4-person households, and the US average is 22. In terms of process, this project is largely geospatial data. So the parcel data changes over time. We're really using county parcel data for all of our tax parcels. To begin with, we took an output of all of the building permits since the last buildable lands inventory and joined those by parcel to the current map, and then also took the 2019 BLI data and joined it to the current parcel map. Because of new parcels and new subdivisions, it is not a perfect one-to-one match. And because of the process of subdivisions and the issuance of building permits, there are times where the building permit is assigned to the parent parcel of the subdivision. So there does need to be some data management at that point. And so what was used were definition queries of examples like, does this field have a building permit data? And then examine those fields. Does this field have a null value in X field, for example? Because if it was a new parcel, that field would be null. So through that iterative process, anything that was lacking classification was classified. This is an example of what my GIS workspace looks like. In this particular case, I have just one parcel highlighted, which happens to be this one here at the corner of Hersey and Oak. And just see, for example, this is the attributes table, and you can see the various fields. And in this case, these are the previous BLI fields, vacant, vacant, vacant. The calculated the number of dwellings that we expect, et cetera. So this is really the working environment where all that data is being managed. And then finally, it's output in a tabular form to go into Excel. The complete data set was over 9,000 records with 30 fields of data. And again, that's because it includes things like the assessor includes data on improvement value and land value, those values from previous years too. Those can be used for assessing redevelopment. So not necessarily all of the fields that are in the data set end up getting used, but it's the full look of the data. And then pivot tables were used to summarize all the tables that are in this document. In terms of the city's land supply, it's very, very similar to what was reported in 2019. There's only been a single annexation in that time, and it would have shown up right about here where the Beach Creek annexation is. So the City of Ashland city limits include, I believe it's 8 acres more than was previously reported. And one thing that always comes up that I find quite interesting is that we have a portion of our city limits that lies outside of our UGB. And this one threw me for a loop when I first got here, the long story short is that part of the city was part of the city since the 1888 map shows it in that boundary. And obviously UGBs were not adopted until much, much, much more recently. So it's a legacy area that we have of city limits land that is outside of our UGB, and I believe we're the only one in the city. In terms of...
in the state.
I'm sorry?
Oh, just was, sorry.
Oh, thank you.
I was just saying that we're the only ones in the city, you said, that would have land outside of.
Oh, I'm sorry. What I was trying to say is I believe we're the only city in the state that has city limits outside of our UGB. Pardon me. This chart is a summary basically of tables 2, 3, and 4 from the report showing the gross acreage and net buildable acres both within city limits and within the UGB. It's worth noting that when I was preparing this slide, it did make me realize that there was an error in one of the tables in the version that made it into your packets. Did any of you catch that, by the way? Which table had an error in it? The short version is the copy of the document that is in the packet did have a mistake on table 3. This is what table 3 should have looked at. And basically there was a mistake in transposing data from Excel into Word. And so this is the updated table 3 that is different than what is in your packet. Again, with all of the BLI data assessed, we also included the estimated number of dwellings that we expected to be able to be built on that land. And these are those totals with 1,407 within city limits and an expected 1,303 within the UGB for over 2,700 dwellings. And this chart is in the document showing that across comprehensive plan designations. Finally, the output of all of that can be represented as a map. Shown here is the 2019 BLI. And the reason I include this first is that this is the 2024 BLI. And even when you know where to look, they're subtle. And so what I'd like to do is basically walk through some of those areas and discuss them in detail. Again, as Brandon said, the map is a component of the BLI, and the data that resides behind all of that is the root of the project. In the North Mountain area, I wanted to highlight a couple of different things here to sort of examine differences between 2019 and the present BLI. On the left here is 2019, and on the right is 2024. And again, even when you know where to look, it doesn't jump out at you necessarily. One of the things that I wanted to point out is places where we have corrected errors that existed in the past. This red arrow that hopefully you can see right here is one example of that. And in 2019, this property was deemed large enough to be capable of potentially being 2 dwellings in the future in subdividing. As it turns out, I happened to notice this year that that is dedicated open space to the surrounding subdivision. And since it's dedicated as open space, it can't be developed. And so that's one example of errors that are being corrected over time. Another interesting change here, because you don't see new vacant land come on very often, is this property on Oak Street between 2019 and 2024 had a demolition done, and so it has become a vacant property. We're going to talk about that property again in just a minute. With regard to Kestrel, it has largely built out. There's still this last phase in the multifamily area that has yet to come online. But I think it's important to look at what was expected versus what actually happened. Examining those 2 parcels there that basically were the completion of Kestrel Parkway and the cottages behind it, the expectation there was 18 units across those 2 large parcels. And there was basically 16 single-family homes and 12 cottages for a total of 28 dwellings in that area. So exceeding our expectation by 10 dwellings. 12 and 15. Okay, I must have that off by 1 then. Thank you. So it must be 12 single-family and 15 cottages for 27. I'll have to go and check that. Thank you. This next property up by Fair Oaks and North Mountain is another great example of how conservative we have a tendency to be. The expectation was that this would develop out to hopefully 5 homes, and I believe it's 25 or 26 apartments presently on that mixed-use building that developed. But we don't always get it right. This parcel here was identified for 15 dwellings in 2019, and it ultimately built out to 3 houses with a large dedication of open space to the parks. Going on, this is what's currently being built out as Magnolia Meadows. It's a part of the greater Mace property, and I just call it out because it's sort of is an example of how long some certain lands take to come online. That subdivision is now approved and being built, but not yet platted. So it is actually vacant, but will be those 11 new homes. Oh, sorry, right here. Yeah, in this corner here? Yeah. In terms of other notes about development, right here where the star is, this is a subdivision that you recently saw that has been approved but not yet platted. The data here is based on when the building permits are issued. And so that has actually already been an approved subdivision, and next time this document is updated, I would expect that that would all be looked at as developed. Similarly, this property on Alicia, in 2019, we identified it for 3 units. As you recall, you recently approved a 4-unit subdivision there, but also it previously had approval for a 12-unit cottage development. And so that's a real good example of how cottage housing really enables density that wouldn't otherwise be possible. And we'll touch on cottages again in just a minute. Next, this property here on Oak, in 2019, it was expected that it would be turned into at least 2 parcels, and it is in the process of being platted for a 3-lot partition. So similarly, the next time this is updated, that will be developed. And then there's another thing that is a interesting notion that I've noticed as I've worked on this data, and we call it the adjacency issue. Each of these properties that you see highlighted here in boxes, while vacant and recorded as a vacant developable property for 1 unit, is owned by an adjacent property owner. And to me, when I see that, I don't think it's a property that's likely to come online soon. But it's a vacant property, it's legally created, and it really is part of our inventory. So it's an interesting thing to note that there's a number of those types of properties in town. Next, over in the West Village area, a similar story is told. The expected load build-out of this subdivision in 2019 was 26 units, with a residential subdivision that included a cottage housing development. I believe my numbers here are right, with 25 single-family lots and then 12 cottage dwellings. What ultimately was expected to be 26 dwellings turned into 37. Same story repeats itself here on Laurel, which was the first cottage housing development. In 2019, it was expected to build out to 3 houses, and I could see why that expectation was made. Maybe a more aggressive call would be 4, but 1 lot, 2 lot, 3 lot, and that ended up being, again, 12 units. Finally, the singular annexation that we've had, Beach Creek, the 2019 shows that 42 lots were expected. This is what it presently looks like in GIS in cartography land, at least as of this data set, which is the end of December 2023. Since that time, the northern portion of this has platted, and the final portion is going to plat shortly. At the end of the day, the expectation was 42 and 52 dwellings, 52 lots in this case. I'm not counting those ARUs that are on these lots. So if you wanted to count actual dwellings, you could include those ARUs as well. So the conclusions, this sort of wraps up what is with regards to the sufficiency of land section. The housing capacity analysis, again, indicated that we would have a demand for 858 dwellings over the 20-year period. This BLI shows that there's 1,407 dwellings potentially capable within the city limits, and that another 1,300 within the UGB exceeding that amount. In terms of housing production, over these last 6 fiscal years, the data is there, but the average is over 90 dwellings per year over that time period. And one of the things we talked about a lot internally is that the BLI document, is a living document, and there have been a lot of changes to the state regulations without necessarily guidance on changes to methodology. We make our estimates to intentionally be conservative, and as I've said repeatedly, it really provides a lower end number, especially when you consider all of the changes that have happened in state law, providing missing middle opportunities. With regard to next steps, the hope would be that the Planning Commission would recommend approval of this document as a technical document to the comprehensive plan to City Council. The City Council is going to review this at a study session on June 3rd, and then the hope is that on June 4th, they will adopt a resolution adopting it. And it's also worth noting that this work is going to be in support of ongoing climate-friendly area planning, and as well as the updated economic opportunity analysis that is just beginning. And with that, I'll take any questions that you might have.
Anybody have any questions? Carrie?
I just have curiosity. I mean, when you're defining potential dwelling units, is there an average size, or are you doing that based on a lot?
Yeah, so it was very lot specific. It begins algorithmically. In the 2019 data set, there was a lot of time spent to add the minimum lot size to the data, and then obviously the minimum lot size for the zone. And so there was a calculated field for this lot's large enough to support that many dwellings. And then that was reviewed and analyzed for logic, for planning obstacles, for areas of steep slope, floodplain, other considerations.
So the recent changes in state law totally throws all of that, you have to redo all those calculations.
No, the methodology stayed the same as it was in 2019. So a single family home lot that was large enough that we were able to deem it, that it would be eligible for subdivision, that we would count that as, that potentially could become another lot.
Okay, so you don't try to bring in the potential for cottages?
Right, it would be impossible to include potential cottage analysis, potential cottage housing analysis into it, because there's so many options when you're considering a site for cottage housing development, right? But I think to answer your question directly, do these numbers reflect the thousands of potential dwellings that could be built because of the new regulations? No.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fine. I was just looking at the numbers from 2019, and it's really unpredictable when you start getting into tiny houses and everything else. And then I guess that's how you look at those houses where people own the lot next door, then it's just, yeah, it's just, I'm appreciating the difficulty of actually predicting what you're going to get.
The BLI, in fairness, is not predicting anything. It's a look.
Opportunity.
Yeah. It's look at the inventory and an analysis of what is possible.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Ray?
Not a question, but a comment. Oh, I'm sorry. Susan's got her hand up. I'm going to defer to Susan.
Okay, Susan?
Okay, that's so I think we can take comfort in the potential relative to the projections, potential supply relative to the predictions of demand. So it's not a screaming fire bell going off saying we've got a huge problem. However, and I do find it interesting, the pattern of more units being developed on properties, if I heard you correctly and read correctly, than perhaps were originally planned, which kind of goes to Carrie's question that, you know, things are evolving as we go. I, having worked in econometric modeling, what I didn't see anywhere in this was appreciation for how the demand for housing might change based on price elasticity. And I find it, you know, odd as a consequence that Ashland would be growing slower than Jackson County, you know, at a fairly slow rate. So it's probably an unfair question for you, Aaron, because you didn't develop the methodology. But I just think it's worth noting, because if the average you know, price of housing in Ashland went down by $100,000, I think we'd have a different forecast in terms of the demand for housing. that there is pent-up demand that is not being met because of the price levels. And I couldn't see any evidence that the model had a way of taking that into consideration.
Brandon, you want to talk to?
Yeah, I can respond a little bit. You're absolutely correct. The buildable lands inventory methodology doesn't incorporate any price controls or looking at the elasticity of price, largely because it's not trying to project the demand for housing, just the supply of land and how many units could be accommodated. I think what changes is the rate of consumption. So where we have a projected 20-year supply of land based on the growth rates provided by the state, if they all drop by 100,000 in your scenario, and we started seeing a dramatic increase in demand, the next housing starts review by the Portland State University would identify that Ashland is growing at a much faster rate than predicted, and then their next population projection would come out showing a higher growth rate, which would then in turn mean that we had less of a term of supply, even if we had the same capacity for 1,407 units, if that makes sense. But I think you're exactly right. The 20-year supply is a variable based on consumption rates that could change based on price.
Right. Well, and the point about it being a living document, and in a world of lots of uncertainties, again, we've got some buffer, which is good news. I just, it's up to others to determine perhaps what a desired growth rate would be, but I was struck by that in the forecasting. So thanks for the answer, Brandon.
So it's more of a comment than a question. I guess I can turn it into a question, but when I look at the section on buildable land that starts on page 6 and then has a couple of paragraphs, there's a nod or a reference to the changes in state law and the potential impacts of that which are unknown and not currently in the model. They're not currently modeled. I don't necessarily, so the comment is I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think it's written effectively. I guess the question is, in the presentation to council, is there any value in that uncertainty driven by the state being more visible? And I'm not suggesting that it should be, but we're nibbling on the edges of those various pieces that are potentially changing the way you plan and the way we see things happen in the future.
I appreciate that note. I appreciate that note, and we will definitely make a point of that.
And it could be really subtle. I mean, it could be just a talking point. It could be part of the soundtrack in your presentation. So I don't know how I think your presentation's good because you're distilling a lot of data in a pretty digestible way. So it could just be it could be a soundbite, So.
Well, and maybe that's a place to add, again, the point that about the forecasts aren't driving the conclusion here, but they are presented as part of the plan and presented as part of the conclusion that there is, likely adequate space. So maybe I'm not getting the difference there, but to me it is a consideration that is worth noting, which is the 5% growth rate, along with the other things that you were pointing out, Greg and Carrie. It's not a perfect science, but if our job is to help advise, that would be my advice.
Yeah, and I think I appreciate that. And the other comment is that I think, you've taken a pretty complex topic with a few interconnected pieces, and I think it's presented pretty well. I mean, you can power through the document in an hour and a half, and so I think, I think it's good. So press ahead.
Thank you.
Russell?
Aaron, thanks for your work on this. It's a lot of detail-orientated stuff, and I can appreciate how much time this took. I just have one question here. We've been producing, on average, 90 units per year over the last several years, and we're only requiring 43 annually in the future. Could you help me understand kind of the how come we're requiring so many fewer units in the future?
Yeah, I guess I would phrase it slightly differently. The housing capacity analysis came to those conclusions, and it's a large document on its own that really delved into, in much more detail than this document did, components of change, socioeconomic scales, and really gets into in more detail of also the type of housing that we need and whatnot. Their bottom line findings were reduced to 858 homes over the 20-year period. That works out to 43 per year. And if, in theory, if you're meeting those numbers, you're meeting the demand that they created. I can't comment on everything with their conclusions, but also this is not a projection of saying, historic trends aren't necessarily going to continue either. But this is a piece of the puzzle, and if you read through the housing capacity analysis, it talks about the BLI, and then you read the housing production strategy, and it talks about the housing capacity, and they all really do link into each other over time. And also, those rates, I guess I would say a couple things about that. As I was looking at this summarized data for when these units came online, it was sobering in figuring out when, because again, it's when the permits are issued. And this is actually underrepresenting a good number of units because more than half, 54 of the 70 units that are under construction right now at the Midtown Lofts, those were issued this fiscal year. And because that data set is still incomplete, I stopped it at the end of the 23 fiscal year. That project was approved in either 2018 or 2019. And so I guess I would just say that that is what has been produced. And I actually, in an original draft, I had a nod to that those numbers would suggest that we're chiseling away at a known deficiency. I was probably getting over my skis and we ended up removing those remarks. But if you believe the findings of the housing capacity analysis and looking at recent trends and what's happening, in theory, enough housing is being produced to meet that demand.
Great, thanks, Aaron. Excuse me.
Okay, so pardon me if I'm being dumb, but if you're saying we're producing the housing that we should, why is there a housing shortage?
Yeah, Brandon may want to jump in here and guide the ship a little bit because we actually had conversations on this topic.
I do want to qualify a bit the housing capacity analysis, identifying that we needed 858 units. That's really in order to accommodate the future population growth over that 20-year period. How many new housing units would be necessary to accommodate that increase in population? It doesn't speak to, unless you look at the mix of housing types, more apartments, less single family, detached, the types of housing that are needed in that period of time to make up for a deficiency of multifamily units being built in the past. So unlike some housing capacity or projections of housing where you look at past performance and project that into the future, if we were always developing 95% of our housing as single family and project that forward, we'd be perpetuating that inequity in multifamily development forward. So the housing capacity analysis said 858 units and skew it heavily to multifamily in order to make up for past deficiencies. It doesn't really relate to, I think, Commissioner McCracken-Jane's comment about the price of housing. And so when we talk about a housing crisis, a lot of people are priced out of the current housing market or overburdened in terms of housing costs. Even if there's units available to them, they're outside of their ability to pay. And so that is the third document in this triad, the housing production strategy. How do we develop housing that is commensurate with the need? The BLI is really just looking at how much land do you have available. The housing capacity analysis is looking at how many housing units do you need. And then the projection strategy is looking at how do you try to steer the market to produce the type of housing units that are needed for the population. I don't know if I answered your question, rather, but in short, I don't think that the addressing the housing crisis is accomplished by projecting out 20 years. It's something that we're looking at what we have to address right now for people that are priced out of the housing market. You know, if the housing market was to collapse, you know, that may resolve that price point issue, and there probably would be no longer an increasing population unless people flooded in which case then those new projections would say 858 units is insufficient. If we're growing at faster than the housing capacity analysis said a 0.4% growth rate. Aaron is now saying it's greater, looking at the new American Community Survey data, pushing 0.7 or 8% on the PSU. So again, it's increasing, still less than 1% growth rate. But the more it increases, the more the recent housing capacity analysis number of 858 is no longer reflecting that population change. So, sorry.
No, that's good. Thank you. Oh, Susan?
So, yeah, so towards that, is there a standard format for the BLI? Because I understand completely what you're saying, Brenda, but it gets a little bit confusing as the reader when it goes from pure supply possibility to having sections talking about demand. And I don't know if there's, you know, a standard way to clarify that, or again, to Greg's point, maybe to have some statements or disclaimers up front said, here are, you know, areas that we think we need to continue to watch and may change for various reasons, et cetera, so that it does a better job of perhaps heading off some of these questions when it goes to the council.
As far as standard format, I think that all that's required, and Aaron, having looked at the ORS recently, is essentially the map and the tables of how many acres are available by zone. So the rest of the information is really a City of Ashland ad in order to provide the demographic background, because, you know, the BLI has served us in policy making and wanting to put more information in there rather than just the straight numbers and that's it. But I think those are good points in terms of adding clarifications of where we're going beyond the scope of a BLI.
Or it could be that you give all three documents to whoever's asking about what's going to happen in the future.
Or tee it up that way, because I think, you know, Brandon, your answer to Lisa's question where you mentioned the relationship between the three, that would be a really good introductory stage setting comment, just to kick off the discussion with the council. There are three interconnected documents. Here's what they do. And we're
going to focus on this one.
We're going to focus
tonight.
on this one piece, recognizing they're still all interconnected as part of the comprehensive plan.
Greg, may I come
Doug?
in, Chair?
Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Greg, you summed up what I've just been chewing on as I listen to this. The buildable lands inventory strikes me as just a very blunt instrument to get some information that is only partially addressing what we need to be discussing. And then the housing capacity fills in the next third of that. And then finally, the conversations that we're all having is the mix. And what is that going to look like? And how are we incentivizing developers in whatever way we can to help us meet what we want to do as far as the types of houses we're getting built, leaving aside the government subsidized stuff. And I think it has to be presented as a whole. If we're here tonight just to recommend the BLI, it's an incomplete picture, and it can't go up by itself.
Well, council's already adopted the housing production strategy and the housing capacity analysis. So this is the the third that they have not adopted.
Okay.
And Doug, and Susan, there's a piece that we have on our tables here, which is a resolution. It's a draft, it looks like a draft resolution that would carry this document to the council.
Right, correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the point of having the public hearing tonight is for us then to is to discuss and potentially make a recommendation to send this to the council. So then they will have looked at all three and presumably adopted all three. Susan, did you have another comment?
I have one more I'd like to add in there. Which
Okay,
is that
go ahead.
I remain unclear as to what we expect of council from our recommendation to implement the efforts that each of these three individual documents are pointing at, but not having been analyzed in a way that gives a direction that we can take and say this is what we want to do and should do and have to figure out a way to do. I'm not getting that clarity.
Well, I don't think there is I know there are three documents. Beyond that, I don't think anybody's put together any synthesis on how they should be used in like
Yeah,
a pithy statement.
Of the three documents, and I'll begin with the 2019 buildable lands inventory, which was the basis for the 2021 housing capacity analysis, which then informed the 2023 housing production strategy. Of those, the only document that has policy implications is the housing production strategy. And so the council's approval of that outlined 15 individual strategic actions related to creating the types of housing that the city would like to see developed in order to address need. But I could clarify, if the chair would allow me, what is being presented both for Commissioner Now and McCracken Jane, as they're not in a receipt of the resolution that's before you. Essentially, we handed out at this evening's meeting a draft resolution that would adopt an amendment to the Ashland Comprehensive Plan, updating the buildable lands inventory as a technical supporting document of the urbanization element of the comprehensive plan. So the section 1 that it states, so that you're aware of what you'll be deciding on this evening, is that the City of Ashland hereby resolves as follows. The City of Ashland, the Council does hereby accept the 2024 update of the buildable lands inventory as set forth in the attached Exhibit A for final consideration and adoption. So it's really just an implementing resolution so that this buildable lands inventory can be used as a factual basis for future policy discussions. We're talking a lot about housing, but it also relates to consumption of employment lands for policies related to economic development as well.
Thank you. I get your point. It's an administrative step.
Susan? You must be muted.
You can't hear me?
Oh, we
Oh,
can
now
now.
we can.
Yeah,
We couldn't before.
sorry, and we do have that document. So, I do, so there's the process part, and then there's the, the storytelling part, and just from the point of view of perhaps helping to have the best and smoothest possible discussion with the council. And again, the memo does start out by saying that there are these three different parts of the whole picture. But if we were confused, probably others will be confused if there isn't, a bit more clarity and maybe even a graphic to get really specific about how these all fit together. Because it is amazing work and very necessary and much appreciated, and appreciate your patience with all the questions.
Well, I think Brandon has taken notes, and he will be doing
Yes.
his best to lead clarification. Okay, so with that, I'm going to close the public hearing. Now we can discuss this item.
I think I appreciate all the questions and comments, and I think the resolution that's before us looks pretty good.
So would you like to make a motion?
I would be happy to move that we support the resolution as presented.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to support the resolution as adopted, as presented. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, it passed. So, okay, we're we dealt with that item. Cool.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're on to election of Planning Commission Chair and Vice Chair. Do we need some discussion on this, or does anybody have a nomination to make, or how do you want to discuss this?
I think you're an amazing chair and should continue if you're willing.
Thank you. Therefore, would you like to make a motion?
I move that you be the chair in the upcoming cycle.
Is there a second to that?
Second.
Okay, we have a multitude of seconds. We have a motion and we have a multitude of seconds. All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so I will continue to be the chair. We also need a vice chair. What'd you say?
I said yes to wrangle this crew into,
I think Doug's an amazing vice chair. I think he would, as he continues to serve, he would be incredible.
And would you like to make a motion to that effect?
So moved.
Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to elect Doug as vice chair, to have him continue in his role. And all those in favor?
Aye.
Can I say a few words before we vote?
Okay.
Just, I've really enjoyed the perks of this job, so.
You'll have to tell me what they are. Okay, all those in favor? Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Okay, all those opposed? I guess I should ask if there's anybody opposed. Okay, so we've got that adopted as well. Moving right along, let's see if we can make this before 8 o'clock. Is there anything else that anybody wants to talk about? Okay, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, it's moved and seconded to adjourn. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, we are adjourned.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.